Right.
Oh, excuse me.
Okay. Right. Today we've got one of our students, Nathan, with us to do a workshop on social cognition. Right. Social cognition. You've got your notes. Take notes as you go on. Remember, this is being recorded, so it will be on YouTube by tonight. And we're also live streaming with Periscope. So hi to everyone on Periscope world. Also, if you're on Periscope, you are welcome to type in questions, which we will then forward to Nathan to answer during the session. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm handing over to Nathan to enjoy the session.
All right. So just a bit of background here. This is a research piece that is in development at the moment. It's going through its final editing stages to be submitted for publication. So it is a theoretical spectrum of social cognition, which throughout this I'll explain the development of it and also how we can apply it to counselling. All right. First of all, what we will end up covering. What we'll end up covering is what the definitions we have that are associated with social cognition and social cognitive development, what the spectrum itself is, what it's made up of, fundamentals, phases and domains of the spectrum, and how it can be applied in a counselling context. Okay, so first of all, we'll cover our definition. So social cognition, as we all are aware, cognition being the ability to think, social cognition looks at the encoding, storage, retrieval and processing of information about conspecifics from members of the same species. So in our case, if we use the Latin term Homo sapien, or if we just want to be normal, we just say humans. And development describes the growth of humans throughout their lifespan from the point of conception all the way to death. Though for social cognitive purposes, we look at development from the point of birth to the point of death. Okay, so the spectrum in itself is basically a model. It's dynamic and on a continuum, and it seeks to explain the development of social cognition in individuals. The model is devised of 4 components, so fundamentals, phases, domains of social cognition, and competencies. So in the research process, getting to this point, how we defined everything was through a period of ethnographic observations. So we'd stand back, we'd just observe reality in itself and make observations based on what is seen, and also through conducting literature reviews of other theoretical developmental models. So just to illustrate what we have here, so the spectrum sits on top of everything, fundamentals branch off to the side, below we've got our phases and domains, and underneath domains we've got competencies, and we'll cover them in a bit more depth shortly. Okay, so what is the spectrum made up of? So really it is a conglomeration of various different developmental theories and psychological concepts. So throughout the research process in our literature review, we identified cognitive development as one of them, particularly the works Piaget did, psychosocial development, such as like the works of Erikson, and also tapping into our moral reasoning and emotional development, psychosexual development, particularly the works of Freud, even though a lot of his works we nowadays look upon and see that there are inconsistencies in the work, though we've used a lot of the baseline material of his to contribute to the spectrum. We also look at identity development, human ecology development, so particularly Bronfenbrenner's theories on the human ecology and how it affects a person's identity. The stages of play, which is a research piece by a developmental psychologist by the name of Part1. We also look at self-determination theories, not so much as a core part of the spectrum, but as an explanation of some of the motivations of social interaction with people. And then we also have cognitive appraisal therapies, theories, I should say, in the mix as well. Okay, so just another picture of what exactly our spectrum ends up looking like.
No, I'm not laughing at you.
Alright, so fundamentals. These are basically they're the rules. They provide regulation to the spectrum. A lot of work I do is developing business resources, and I've, for the last 2 weeks, looked at legislation, and basically the best analogy I can give is the spectrum itself would be the legislation. The fundamentals are the regulations which say this is what you need to do. So they're basic rules and extensions that are allowed to be made in the spectrum across all of its different aspects. And the fundamentals are the phase age expectancy, there's a non-conformance principle, transitional competencies, backward referral principle, and developmental limitation. Okay, so phase age expectancy, one of the many criticisms we see in developmental models, such as Piaget's one, is that there's an expectation that the cognitive development will be achieved in a certain age bracket. What instead we've looked at here is we have labelled an expectancy rather than this is the age bracket that you will be achieving it in. And this is done through observations of how people have been interacting. So through this we've seen certain age groups demonstrate these abilities, but at the same time they may not demonstrate the exact same abilities at an older age level as what their peers do. So there are exceptions to the phase age expectancy, which we cover in other fundamentals, and the only exception to this fundamental is the very first stage called the conceptual phase, because that's the point of birth. And if there's a baby that can talk fluent English, please show me.
You've had some comments about that one, have you? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. No.
Any
Go.
questions? Or
No.
Okay. So next thing is we have non-conformance principle. Oh, I'm in your way. Sorry. So this basically states that an individual does not need to conform to all aspects of social cognition and all the competencies in the representative phase that they're in. What we do is we determine what phase of social cognition they are in through demonstration of a majority of social cognitive competencies relating to that phase. So if we look at using Piaget for example, I'm really bashing him up at the moment, aren't I? In his stages of cognitive development, it is stated that to be concrete operational you need to do this, and this. Whereas in this we say, as long as you can master more than 50%, you're deemed in that phase. And this allows for achievement of social cognition over separate sections of the spectrum at the levels that are relevant to the individual, and it also means it doesn't constrain or discriminate against people. So then we have transitional competencies. So certain competencies of social cognition domains can be transitional from one phase to another, and they can either transition of one or two ways. So there's evolutionary transitions, and what they are is they're competencies that begin at a basic point and by the next phase they evolve into a higher level of cognition. Many competencies in this spectrum follow evolutionary transition. One of the big examples is communication skills. So we see from a baby, they start out by crying and using nonsensical noises to communicate. And then by the next stage, they're starting to form very simple sentences. And then by the time they reach the last phase, they're able to communicate across a broad range of communication.
Situation.
Yeah. The other type of transitional competency is a static one. So they basically remain the same for all points of the spectrum and can be apparent in other phases of social cognition. They're not as common, but they do occur. A good example of this is if we look at Erikson's work, the very first life crisis, trust versus mistrust. Developing the ability to trust will carry on throughout every single stage of the spectrum. We have the backwards referral principle. This basically states that a person is able to be at one stage of the spectrum but refer back to a previous phase and enact certain behaviours relating to the competencies. So we're not to confuse this with our transitional competencies. A good example of this is a person may be at a higher level of communication on the spectrum, but they still are able to refer back to their very first phase and cry. So that's an example of that there.
Okay.
And the very last phase, which we refer to as the societal phase, gives rationale to this principle in that individuals are able to function at much higher social cognitive levels, but also enact on their competencies from previous levels. And we've got one more, and that's developmental limitation. And throughout the research process, this is something that was picked up a lot. A lot of developmental models don't actually account for the limitation in some individuals. So what we've said is it accounts for individuals who, due to circumstances of psychological development, even in some cases physiological development, are limited in their capacity to achieve beyond a certain phase of the spectrum, or they're limited in their ability to achieve certain competencies in the spectrum. One of the things that we have to do is conduct a bit more research to understand exactly what different conditions impact on the model to define the parameters of this fundamental, because every condition is different. And what this basically does is it removes what's referred to as the mastery paradigm associated with stage models. So go back to bagging out Piaget here. It's considered that you're at the peak of cognitive development when you hit the formal operation stage. In this here, we look at it as you reach the peak of your level of development, not the level of development on the phase. That is considered the peak. It is your level. So in saying that, not everyone is able to actually master every single competency or phase. So now we actually come to the phases. So we've divided into 5 phases, and with each one's been given a socio-cultural designation as the observations that we've seen, really based around the age groups that occur for these names that we've picked. So conceptual being life has started, individual, I'm learning about me, this is me, I'm playing with myself kind of thing. That sounded really bad actually.
I myself.
Then the institutional level, so primary school starting, organisational level, we're looking at and getting into more of your senior primary, high school, starting the workforce. Then the societal level, they're contributing back into society. Right. Okay, so we'll start off with our first 2 phases, the conceptual phase and individual phase. So conceptual phase, as I've mentioned before, starts at birth, and this is basically the start point for everyone. No real exceptions here, unless you can find me that baby that can actually talk in fluent English. So it's expected that they'll begin to transition to the next phase by the age of 2. And in this stage, what we see is they have very limited social cognition and they're developing their very basic social skills. So, for example, they will cry out to communicate, they know who to trust and who not to trust, and stuff like that. Individual phase, we see as they're beginning to constantly socialise with others, but in a very limited capacity to each other. And social exploration and orientation is the primary focus of this part of the spectrum. So they're just coming to grips with the world and what exactly they can, what exactly is going on around them. The next 2 phases is our institutional, and I made stuff up here, that's supposed to be organisational. Institutional and organisational phase. So the institutional phase aligns with the expected age range of 5 to 10. And we see them socialising internally and externally in an institutional environment. So basically that's saying they learn to interact with their peers in the classroom, outside the classroom. They learn to interact with family and friends outside of school and people in authority. The organisational phase is really centred around the introduction of your senior primary, high school, and their entrance into a vocation or work role, really. And it's characterised by their socialising in an organised environment. So if we remember back to our primary school days, the level of social interaction we had in primary school was very different to what we have in our high school setting and in the workplace even. And then finally we come to the societal phase, and this is seen as the pinnacle of social cognition. So what we've witnessed and observed is that people start to achieve dominance over this level of social cognition from the age of 16 onwards. So this is a very generous age designation. The only reason why we put it in is because that was the lowest age that we actually observed these interactions occurring. But the actual average is closer to your 30 mark than anything. But people do start demonstrating, even if it is 1 or 2 of the competencies, by the age of 16. So in this, they practice socialisation at the individual, institutional, organisational phase, but they're doing this by demonstrating their participation in society. Okay. So domains. Social cognition has been classified into 8 skill groups, which we refer to as domains, because it sounds a bit better than skill groups. And it also has a bit more of a better flow to it when you consider the domains of thinking as well. Each domain has its own unique influence on social cognition. And what they do is they act as schemes of competencies of social cognition. So like we see with Piaget's work, where he talks about schemata, organising information into different schemes. This is basically what we see in social cognition as well. Some domains influence each other, but the competencies cannot transition from one domain to another.
Can you give an example of that?
Give an example? Okay, so... Oh, God. Okay, so communication lies primarily in the communication domain. So the ability to speak to another person lies in that level. It can influence emotional responses, but the emotional response is tied more so to the thinking process rather than the actual communication. So you won't see, to put an example, at the individual phase, a child doesn't really have much control over their emotions. They're not, while they might yell and scream at you saying I hate you and all that, they're demonstrating their communication in the communication domain,
Yeah.
but the emotional response that's tied into that comes from the emotional domain.
Okay.
Yeah. So we also don't have any order of superiority to these domains. They all play a vital role in the development. So, yep. What I'll do is just put it up here. This here is a mind map I have done up of the different domains and the areas of competency that we witness in social cognition. So we've got our communication, organisation, sexuality, play, peer interaction, perspective, cultural, identity and emotional. And we'll cover this a bit more in depth. Okay, so we'll cover our first four. So communication, this is the basic linguistic dialogue that is necessary for socialisation. The communication domain looks at deploying stimuli, analysing these stimuli, and the creation of text, whether it be verbal, written, or visual. Organisation is a receptive series of social competencies where an individual is able to create these organisational schemes of information and looks at the process of classification within this domain to identify information. So one of the major things we looked at with this, particularly in organisation, is the structuring of relationships and the hierarchy of society as well. We also witnessed that stereotyping is one of the competencies witnessed in this area as well. And I'll just bring this up here. So while stereotyping sits in the organisational domain, it's used in a manner to organise information, but it also appears in other domains as in a different capacity as well. So for example, like in the identity domain, they use cliques to develop their identity, which is based around a stereotype. Sexuality, so as I mentioned, it's heavily influenced by the works of Freud on the ego and the id. What we see is it is very subconsciously present in our development, and it only unfolds during our adolescence years.
When is the development of that though?
Adolescence years?
No. You say unfolds. So do you mean it just really just starts?
Yeah,
to
we
develop
start
in
witnessing
the
it in explicit observation. One of the things that we have actually identified, and this was through a bit of case study work, is in the earlier phases, particularly when people who are in primary school. Are you familiar with the works of Freud at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so he says before adolescence that people repress their libido. And what we've noticed is an assumption of sexual identity can be made based on this repression, because they will interact with members of the sex that is opposite to their sexual preference. So a lot of what we saw is a lot of heterosexual males would primarily interact with males during their primary school years, whereas males who identify as homosexual would primarily interact with their female cohort over the males. So,
Okay. And females too? So females
yeah, same principle with that. We
with males?
haven't really gotten the chance to touch on like transgender identity and stuff like that. So that's something that could be looked at a bit further with this concept. And then when they hit their adolescence years, that's when they start becoming bratty and obnoxious, and it's all about their relationship with this person and stuff like that, and they start enacting on their sexual desires and initiating in our social sexual rituals that we see. like dating, kissing, holding hands, the little "I love this person" notes in their books and stuff like that.
Just a question.
Yeah.
What do you think of Freud's theory about that? You know, that they hang out with their really pretty much their own sex until such time as puberty. Because I've got a theory on that too.
It is a good point. Like, I did mention earlier, a lot of Freud's work we look back on now and we think,
because it's probably not so much about repression
yeah,
as it is the equipment isn't ready. You know,
yeah,
when the equipment's ready, you play with it, right? So, I mean, what's the point of saying it's repression?
Yep.
yeah.
I think it's crazy.
That is a good point.
You know,
yeah.
when everything starts developing and you can use it, then you use it.
Yeah.
In the meantime, you might as well play and learn and socialise. So,
And
so maybe he was just really a bit fixated on that.
yeah, well, he did write his penis envy theories, so.
Yeah.
You know, he's probably right about that one.
Yeah. But yeah, I do agree. It's not so much a repression; it's just not ready. Yeah, that's a good point, and really
And developmental.
Yeah.
It's
Basically
like
what
the
we're saying.
logical answer that he never looked at.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
Well, we'll just go a bit off track here. My mentor has actually given me this book to read, and it's basically Freud's penis envy theory. But what it's done, it's been rewritten by a female and writing about a male. And as you read through it, there's like footnotes, and when you get to a footnote, you got to stop, and it's like saying, like, men start doing the washing when their father was demasculated by the mother, so they've got insecurities about their penis and stuff like that. So it is something that the sexuality spectrum, because it is something that we still even look at to today in biological senses. Like, there's so many different theories about the origin of sexuality, whether it is a social construct, a biological construct, or
Biological.
yeah.
As a female, I'd like to say I don't think it's penis envy so much as it is an envy of the freedom of the man, of the male.
Yeah,
The males
yeah.
have more freedom than
Yeah,
females, and I think it's that we're envious of, not the actual physical thing.
Yeah.
Historically, yeah.
Because,
Yeah,
you know,
but-
ours is prettier.
That's it.
Whatever.
Oh, yeah,
Anyway.
okay.
Yeah,
No
okay,
visuals, please.
we'll move on from this.
Yeah.
But yeah, sexuality, basically, we look at it as identity and interaction perspective itself, and the observation of interaction and the correlating sexuality. It's something that needs a bit more quantitative data to be accurately determined. So
Or a completely new theory, it'd be
Yeah.
great.
yeah, completely new theory. We'll get onto that.
Using common sense. Oh, hell
Now that's a value judgment.
So with this theory, the spectrum itself, it is very much a baseline theory that has been developed so people can go, right, well, sort of like what Piaget and Vygotsky had written. Theirs was based on observation. People have come along and nitpicked it and said, well, this doesn't work. And for example, like with Piaget's work, they've suggested there is a possibility of a post-formal operational stage of development. And this is what we're opening this up to, is for people to come in, jump in and say, well, you know, let's do a bit more research on this certain aspect, and the results may be the same, they may be different. So the next thing we look at is play, and particularly peer interaction in play. And as Piaget stated, the play is the way anything new comes about. This is how we learn things through our interaction with others. Importance of play and peer interaction occurs in this process, and our competencies of play, especially at our individual phase, relate to Part1's research on the different stages of play, and there's heaps of them.
Is that adolescently, or is that as we progress?
Well,
through
adolescent,
adolescence?
in the individual phase, so we're starting to look at like their toddler years, moving on to primary school. There's very different stages of play that they interact in, but they do carry on over the different phases, so they become more structured and systematic as you go on along the phase. Perspective. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. It is really a form of that should be intrapersonal intelligence.
Intrapersonal, okay.
Yeah, intrapersonal because it's about the external rather than internal. It's how we deal with others and how we perceive others. And it looks at things such as our perspective, egocentrism, also stereotypes pop up here again, and the ability to be impartial. We've also got the cultural domain of social cognition. So this helps shape an individual's identity. So this is a case where one domain may influence upon another. It provides a context for our socialisation because if we look at different social and cultural groups, they all have different protocols to communicate, to interact, what's right, what's wrong. And it also forms context for the social interaction with others in that same identity or association group.
Would I be right in saying that the protocols influence the domains, but the domains don't influence each other?
Yeah, so like the competencies will influence something from another domain, yeah. So good example, what you said about protocols here, we see like social and cultural protocols dictating behaviour in our emotional responses. Yeah. Next.
Sorry. No, it's me. I'm clicking my pen.
Identity. This plays a crucial role in our socialisation because when we're looking at this, we propose this existential question: if we don't know who we are, how can we socialise with others? And what we saw is it links really closely with the interpersonal intelligence people have, and having a deep understanding of self. What's the strengths?
Intra.
What's that?
Intrapersonal? Did you say or inter?
Inter. I believe it's. I'm terrible when it comes to these prefixes.
Inter and intras.
Yeah. So identity is about the intelligence of self, whereas your perspective is about the intelligence of others. Yeah, so we look at a deep understanding of self. Who am I? What's my purpose in life? La la la. I ask that question myself. I get stuck at who am I most of the time. They also look at what's their strengths and weaknesses, likes and dislikes, what makes them unique, and being able to predict their own reactions and emotions. So this is where another example of where the competencies here start influencing our emotional competencies, because identity is closely related to personality, and personality closely relates to emotional responses as well. So if you've got somebody who's got an aggressive personality, their emotional responses tend to be aggressive.
It's how you perceive yourself is how you perceive others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. And in this domain, a lot of existential questions proposed by Erickson in his stages of personal development are incorporated in this, and we also see people starting to align themselves to different discourses and cliques, and that's where the identifying to a stereotype comes into this here, and also where culture ties in as well. Our final domain is our emotional domain. So these determine behaviour, resilience, reaction to consequences, and beginning to form emotional responses that are dictated in society by the social protocols. So if we, let's say, were to go to the shops and we've got a couple in their mid-20s walking through the shops, the guy wants to get a Mars bar, the girl says, no, you can't have it, he throws himself on the floor, has a tantrum. He's not really demonstrating his response is dictated by social protocol. That's very much